Fellas, nearly every single commentator in the UFC has at least a little bit of bias, but there are some fighters in the UFC who get that glaze and get that bias a little bit more from certain commentators than others. There are certain fighters that commentators just seem to be more drawn to, so I'm going to be going through some UFC fighters that the main UFC commentators, and when I say main, I'm talking about the Joe Rogans, the DCs, the Bispings, the Aniks, glaze the most. The ones that they tend to glaze and have more bias to the most, other fighters. So we're going there with the first main commentator, which is Joe Rogan. Now, Joe Rogan is a master glazer. There's so many fighters that you could have done for Joe Rogan, but considering we've just had UFC 305, I'll go with the first one on this list, and it's Israel Adesanya. Adesanya has always been somebody that Joe Rogan has glazed. There's been so many, just examples of Joe Rogan being so high on Adesanya, and he just seems to be a massive fan favorite for Joe Rogan is Israel Adesanya. Now, one of the biggest examples of Joe Rogan glazing Adesanya is in one of the most biased commentaries in UFC history. When Adesanya fought Jan Blachowicz, in this fight, Jan Blachowicz was winning comfortably, but Joe Rogan was talking as if, Jan Blachowicz was getting outclassed, as if he wasn't doing enough, and if Adesanya was cruising to a decision win, and if Adesanya was dominating that fight. And it wasn't just Joe Rogan, it was also DC, which I'll talk about in a second, but even in the comment section of the fight of Adesanya and Jan Blachowicz, everyone was saying the same thing. Adesanya would feint, and Joe Rogan would for some reason go crazy when Adesanya would feint, and when Jan Blachowicz would land an actual decent shot, whether it be a leg kick or a nice jab to the face, Joe Rogan would go silent. There was even a point at the end of the fight where I think, Jan Blachowicz, did a solid leg kick on Israel Adesanya. Adesanya didn't check, but Joe Rogan was adamant that Adesanya checked the kick, and when Jan Blachowicz won the fight, Joe Rogan went silent. That was one of the most biased commentaries in UFC history, and it wasn't even like Adesanya was fighting some, not so heard of up-and-coming contender. He was facing another champion, Jan Blachowicz, and still Adesanya got all the glaze from Joe Rogan, so that's one example of Joe Rogan doing a master glaze in Israel Adesanya. Still to this day, one of the most biased commentaries in the UFC. And if you are going to watch that Jan Blachowicz versus Adesanya fight back, I highly suggest you watch it without the commentary. And if we're going to talk more recently, go back 2 weeks ago, UFC 305. Joe Rogan did a fight companion on his YouTube channel for UFC 305 with a couple other people. And the entire fight, it was just no credit to Dricus du Plessis. It was just Adesanya this, Adesanya that. And then when Dricus du Plessis managed to get the submission, look how devastated Joe Rogan was. He wanted Adesanya to win. I don't know if he had money on Adesanya, but he was devastated when Dricus du Plessis got the win. And the entire fight, he kind of just got humbled in that fight companion, to be fair, because the entire fight companion, he was just talking about how well Adesanya's doing and how it's so hard to face him. Then when he got submitted, Joe Rogan again just went absolutely silent. That's another example of Joe Rogan going ham on Israel Adesanya, and he's just always been somebody that Joe Rogan's never really been able to discredit or never been able to credit the opponent of Adesanya. Another fighter that Joe Rogan seems to glaze a lot is actually Adesanya's, one of Adesanya's biggest rivalries, and it's also Alex Pereira. Now, I can sort of understand why he's so high on Pereira. I mean, he is literally pound for pound 2 in the world right now in the UFC, so it's not like he's having these bad performances where it would be unfair to, credit Pereira. But one thing I will say is it's like a reoccurring theme. Every single time Pereira fights, Joe Rogan likes to talk about how big Alex Pereira is for the light heavyweight division, how tall and powerful this dude is compared to the rest of the division, how crazy it was that he ever made 185, and it just seems like when it comes to the light heavyweight division, Joe Rogan can't have a normal conversation about the light heavyweight division without having to bring up Alex Pereira in some way, shape, or form. And another thing that I didn't really understand about Joe Rogan when it came to Alex Pereira was at UFC 303, when Alex Pereira went out there and obviously got that great knockout over Yuri Prochazka, and immediately Joe Rogan was so adamant that Alex Pereira should go up and face John Jones. Does he not remember a couple of pay-per-views ago, UFC 295, he was commentating Tom Aspinall when he knocked out Sergey Pavlovich, who was at the time the #1 contender for the interim belt and should rightfully be next to the heavyweight, heavyweight belt. Joe Rogan, a commentator, shouldn't be going down the route of not giving Aspinall the title shot, and I can almost guarantee that if Joe Rogan was at that UFC 304 commentary desk, he would have been saying that Aspinall should have been next for the belt. So it's another one of these guys that Joe Rogan seems to be obsessed with, is Alex Pereira. Again, for good reason. He's a fan favorite, he's fun to watch, and he's pound for pound one of the best, but Joe Rogan's definitely got some sort of bias to Pereira. Another fighter, if we're talking about more recently, that Joe Rogan likes to glaze is Ian Garry. I've noticed that Joe Rogan seems to have a thing for Ian Garry as well, specifically in that fight with Jeff Neal. In that entire fight with Jeff Neal, it was just all talk about Ian Garry, how well Ian Garry's doing, nothing really crediting Jeff Neal, when if anything, it was Jeff Neal walking forward trying to make it a fight, and it was Ian Garry trying to avoid a scrap, and it ended up being a split decision, which just shows how close the fight was. But for some reason, Joe Rogan didn't want to say anything beneficial to Jeff Neal, apart from maybe his boxing was good, as shown in the Shavkat fight. But again, just master bias to Ian Garry in that fight with Jeff Neal. And then to make things worse, he goes on the comment, he goes and interviews Ian Garry after after the fight, and he goes and starts talking about how he doesn't deserve the hate and he doesn't understand why he's getting boos. Like, Joe, you literally dip your feet in MMA once a month when there's a UFC pay-per-view in America. You don't pay attention to MMA. Of course, you're not going to understand why Ian Gary's disliked. You weren't there for the Neil Magny situation when you trashed Neil Magny in the press conference. You haven't been seeing, you haven't been seeing how arrogant Ian Gary is. You've just seen that there's a new up-and-coming prospect. You've been interested in him, and now you don't understand the hate, and that's it. Of course, you're not going to understand why people dislike Ian Gary. So we seem to have a little bit of a thing for Ian Gary. Keeps calling him one of the best, best up-and-comers in the welterweight division, and I guess he is undefeated, but he's definitely very beatable. And then finally, I mean, I've got to throw back to this fighter that Joe Rogan, on this dude's come up, he was one of the most glazed dudes in the UFC, Ryan Hall. Listen, I never knew Joe Rogan was such a big fan of jiu-jitsu until I heard him talk about Ryan Hall. When Ryan Hall was on his come up in the UFC, this might have been when Joe Rogan was the most biased commentator to a certain fighter out of everybody. I mean, just go back and watch that fight with Ilia Topuria, who's now one of the best in the UFC. That entire fight, Topuria was doing well. Topuria was beating Ryan Hall and doing well, but Joe Rogan just kept bringing up how dangerous Ryan Hall's jiu-jitsu is, how Topuria's in trouble, and then when he went for the finish, when Topuria went for the finish against Ryan Hall, he started going on about how Ryan Hall's how Ilia Topuria's in trouble and how Ryan Hall's about to lock up a submission. A couple of seconds later, he gets separated from consciousness and Joe Rogan goes silent. And it's not even just that fight. Any fight of Ryan Hall's career that Joe Rogan commentated, he would always talk about how good his jiu-jitsu is, how he's the next big thing in the UFC. And even when Ryan Hall's not even fighting, he would go back and start reminiscing about the career of Ryan Hall for how good his jiu-jitsu is. There are just some fighters that seem to have that Joe Rogan bias, and Ryan Hall for some reason was one of those guys because Joe Rogan was completely obsessed with Ryan Hall. But those are a couple of fighters that I seem to see get glazed a lot by Joe Rogan specifically, the ones that stand out in my opinion. And then we'll go to DC. Maybe not as bad as a commentator when it comes to bias as Joe Rogan, but there's definitely a few fighters that DC definitely has as favourites. The first one being Islam Makhachev. Obviously Makhachev is a very... Well, listen, I'm not going to sit here and again, it's similar to Alex Pereira. Makhachev's pound for pound #1 in the UFC. I can see why he would credit Islam Makhachev, but he's obviously going to be somewhat biased to him. He trains in the same gym as Islam Makhachev, or at least he did at times. He's very, very close with Islam Makhachev, a very good friend of his. So he's always going to have that secret bias to Islam Makhachev. You could see it on his come up when he was facing Oliveira. It was always how Oliveira needs to avoid the danger and nothing to do with how Islam Makhachev needs to avoid the danger of Oliveira. But again, I can kind of understand where DC's coming from because Makhachev, is now the best fighter in the world. And it just kind of comes down to any Dagestani fighter, specifically the ones that train in the same gym it is. But you go and watch that Sandhagen versus Nurmagomedov fight. Again, all the hype is on Nurmagomedov. There's nothing really talked about Sandhagen from DC. Or whenever there's just a new Dagestani fighter on the come up, like I said, specifically the ones that train at AKA, DC just tends to have some sort of bias, specifically towards the UAE fighters as well. Even on Abu Dhabi cards as well, you'll notice that whenever there's an Abu Dhabi card, DC will definitely have some sort of bias to the home fighters in Abu Dhabi. I don't know what it is about those Abu Dhabi guys and those UAE guys that DC seems to like, but there's definitely something that DC has towards those Dagestani fighters. And then another fighter that I've noticed that DC seems to like a lot is Kamaru Usman. Specifically in those fights with Leon Edwards, I noticed that DC was quite biased towards Kamaru Usman. One example was when Leon Edwards got one of the most spectacular knockouts in UFC history against Usman. Knocked him out cold, got an amazing knockout, and DC looked absolutely appalled when he got KO'd. Now, I know DC tends to do that quite a lot when fighters get KO'd, but dude, he looked like he was about to cry. He looked like he was about to cry when Usman got KO'd by Leon Edwards. And apart from, him saying, oh my God, a few times, didn't really have much else to offer on the commentary apart from he was writing his obituary. And then to make things worse, in the trilogy of Leon Edwards, Usman and Leon Free, there was a lot of bias on Usman as well in that fight about how good his wrestling is. And I feel like DC went into the fight with Leon and Usman, the trilogy, thinking that Usman was going to get the win, thinking that, Leon Edwards, if he doesn't land the big shot, Usman's going to get the win. And that's kind of what DC talked about the entire fight. It was just talking about Usman's wrestling, breaking down how good Usman's wrestling is. And I've not got him on this list, but even Derek Lewis as well. You can tell that DC's got a thing for Derek Lewis, because I remember when Tatu Bivalto knocked out Derek Lewis, DC, you could just tell on commentary he wasn't happy with it. He wanted Derek Lewis to get that win, and he seems to have a little bit of a bias to Derek Lewis as well. But those are some of the fighters that I've noticed that DC tends to be biased to a lot. A lot of the UAE fighters, the Dagestani fighters, Islam Makhachev and Kamaru Usman, some of those guys definitely have some sort of glaze from DC. Another commentator we have is Michael Bisping, a guy who's commentated most fight nights, occasionally will commentate a pay-per-view, especially if there's an event in the UK. Now, I've just got to get it out of the way. The The first fighter for Michael Bisping is Tom Aspinall. Tom Aspinall is probably the most glazed fighter by Michael Bisping, not even just on the commentary booth, but everywhere. Now, again, it's one of those fighters where I can understand. I'm with Bisping on this one. Aspinall's the best heavyweight in the world. I'm with him that I want to see him fight John Jones. But you watch Tom Aspinall fight, and listen, if you're not an Aspinall fan or you're just a guy who's trying to watch it from boss perspective, I can see why you might get frustrated, especially that Marcin Tybura fight. Aspinall came back from his injury. The glaze on Aspinall was insane in this fight. Aspinall would throw a shot, he'd just start talking about how quick he is, landed the most basic body kick, started calling it a punishing body kick, had absolutely nothing to say about Marcin Tybura in that fight. And again, I know Tybura's levels behind Tom Aspinall, but again, it just whenever Aspinall fights, when Bisping's commentating, there's never really any talk about the opposition. It's always about how good Tom Aspinall is, and it will be good to hear a bit from the other side and how good Tom Aspinall's opponents are, rather than just glazing Aspinall the entire fight. And I mean, just look at when Tom Aspinall knocked out Sergey Pavlovich, Michael Bisping's reaction in the crowd. One of the most hyped reactions from a commentator I've seen. But then again, I understand. Listen, Bisping and Aspinall are close. They're friends, similar to like a guy like Makhachev and DC. I'm not saying it's bad that, Bisping's got bias to Tom Aspinall. I don't blame him. But it's definitely a fighter that Bisping seems to have some sort of bias to, and you can expect that he's going to be biased towards Aspinall if he ever commentates an Aspinall fight in the future. And just in general, UK fighters, whenever there's an event in the UK, definitely a lot of bias from Michael Bisping towards these guys. I mean, specifically Paddy Pimblett as well. Whenever Paddy Pimblett was fighting in those early fight nights in the UK, and even in his fight with Bobby Green, it was all the focus was on Paddy Pimblett, not the opponents. Even in Paddy Pimblett's UFC debut, when he got caught by a big shot as well. So yeah, just a lot of talk on Paddy Pimblett. And then Paul Craig as well. Paul Craig seems to get battered in a lot of his fights. One that reminds me of when he fought Volkan Oezdemir in the UK. He fought Volkan Oezdemir in the UK, and rather than him giving any credit to Volkan Oezdemir and say what Oezdemir is doing well, it was all about what Paul Craig's doing bad, and how Paul Craig can find the submission, and how Paul Craig can get the win, and how he needs to finish. And there was no talk on Volkan Oezdemir. So just in general, a lot of the UK fighters tend to get a lot of glaze and a lot of bias from Michael Bisping. And then finally for Michael Bisping is Anthony Smith. Now, it's not really often that we see Bisping commentate a fight from Anthony Smith, considering that Anthony Smith, I mean, he's mainly, well, he tends to be on a lot of pay-per-views, and obviously Bisping's not on a lot of pay-per-views, and it's very rare that we'll see them commentate Bisping commentate Smith's fights. But one that reminds me is Ryan Spann versus Anthony Smith too. Again, all the talk just on Anthony Smith. Nothing that Ryan Spann's doing well. None of the shots that Ryan Spann are landing he ever talked about. It was all about how Anthony Smith needs to get the win and how he needs to pull it out the fire and everything like that. And again, I can understand he literally has a podcast with Anthony Smith, so I feel like whenever Bisping's commentating a fight with Anthony Smith, it's always going to be quite biased. It's always going to be quite unfair to Anthony Smith, and he definitely seems to have a bit of an emotional connection to Anthony Smith. So those are the fighters that Bisping seems to glaze more than others. And then finally, John Anik, in my opinion, the least biased commentator in the UFC, but he still had his moments as John Anik, even though he is fairly unbiased. I'd say recently Belal Muhammad seems to be a fighter that John Anik seems to be definitely kind of swayed towards a lot. He seems to have some sort of thing with Belal Muhammad. Before the fight with Leon Edwards, he was always congratulating him on how he got his title shot, how he's ready to see him fight Leon Edwards, and he seems to have a lot more, I don't know how to say it, but he seems to be a lot more comfortable and a lot happier with Belal Muhammad getting a title shot than he normally does. And he just kept bringing up Belal Muhammad before the fight with Leon Edwards, more than he normally does with an average pay-per-view. So that off the bat already started raising concerns. And then after the fight, started tweeting about Cry, as if it was like, yeah, I don't know. It just seemed odd how John Anik suddenly became this massive fan of Belal Muhammad, commentating Cry, saying that he shut the haters up. And again, he never really does this to any other fighter whenever any other fighter wins on a pay-per-view. So John Anik definitely seems to have a thing for Belal Muhammad, and he definitely seems to have some sort of thing about shutting the haters up with Belal Muhammad, which I just never understood. And then I've just got to include as well Aljamain Sterling. Now, the reason I'm saying Aljamain Sterling is for one reason and one reason only, and it's the quote when John Anik went out and said that he could lose by a head kick 30 seconds into the fight and he's still the greatest bantamweight of all time for me. I completely, severely, I just don't understand what John Anik's thought process is. I mean, even now that he's lost, he's still not the greatest bantamweight of all time. I think Dominic Cruz is the greatest bantamweight of all time. Sterling didn't have the best title run. And to say that if he went in there with that fighting shot against Sean O'Malley and got head kicked and KO'd in the first 30 seconds and was still be the greatest bantamweight of all time, I never understood that. He's not done enough to build a good enough legacy. His title run wasn't that impressive, and Dominic Cruz is just shits on Aljamain Sterling legacy-wise. So those are the two main fighters I've seen John Anik kind of glaze the most. But those are the fighters that the main commentators in the UFC seem to glaze the most. The ones that they seem to be most biased towards. And the ones that just seem to be the most unbearable whenever they're fighting. So let me know your thoughts on this list, and if there was any other fighters that I missed out that the commentators seem to glaze a lot. And thank you for watching.